I just had a really long talk, well, a 2 hour talk with Seale about Moxy data. So he's a fairly new Moxy user. Not so new, but a couple months, half a year, something like that. Very enthusiastic, he's collecting lots of data. He definitely has the right approach. This kind of somewhat exploratory reading up on information. And we went through, I think, some maybe more difficult, confusing examples of data that he has, and he wanted to ask him some questions about that. And we talked about it. It's much more discussion because some of the data is not that easy to interpret. At least it's not that easy to interpret honestly. If you're taking a priori knowledge and trying to apply it rather than explain away differences post hoc. Now, and some really good examples that I've also seen and ones that I'm stumped on. So you'll notice during the talk that I don't actually have that good of answers for many of them, even though I do think there's discussions to be had around them. And I'm sure that different people have different opinions or stronger opinions to this than I do. I think these examples will actually go up into the Moxy Monitor backers forum, where other people can maybe give their input and we have a discussion about the data and about some of these ideas. So the whole point of the video was to get a shout out for the Moxy Kickstarter, which is a couple days left, and we were successful, so there's no risk anymore. Go be a backer, get your rewards, and then you can also participate in the backers forum. So then you can participate in the further discussion around these data points that me and Sean discussed in this video. Again, it's very long. It's our whole. It's unedited. It's up there for people to watch if they want to battle their way through it. You definitely get an idea of ideas that we know, of maybe some approaches to interpret data, and things that we don't know, and maybe that we need to be cautious of. Don't shy away. So don't confuse. Where I tell people, don't confuse the acknowledgement that certain answers are unclear with insecurity, because there are strong decisions that can be made when when wanting to apply this data to training. Just as strong as with other measurement tools. But we at Moxy, or I definitely am also very honest about things that we don't know, and this isn't to be confused with a lack of knowledge or understanding in the same sense. It has to do with biology just being generally messy and difficult to interpret at times. That's just the world we live in. So please enjoy the video and support the Kickstarter. Thanks. To think about the Kickstarter again. That's the main focus. And I thought a good way of doing that is maybe talking about some practical examples. And I thought maybe because you've been working with Moxy intensively the last couple of weeks, couple of months, I don't know how long, that maybe you have some examples that we could talk about, and you can give me what you think is happening, and I can give you what I think is happening, and maybe it helps people, maybe it confuses people, but maybe it helps people with how to interpret Moxy data, and maybe motivates people to want to support the Kickstarter.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. So to give a bit of context, I got a Moxy a bit over 6 months ago, I believe. Okay. And I would say my main mistake at first was not to use it enough. What I would recommend to any person getting a Moxy now is literally wear it every day. Like whether it's you're training, whether you're training someone, whether you're just sitting around your house or you're moving boxes, like wear the damn thing and just learn to read it, because that is probably the steepest thing, that where the learning curve is to just get familiar with all the reactions, and the interactions between the trends is so important. So I feel like that's probably one area that I have been lacking in. And so as a result of that, what I've been trying to do is just, like you said, using it as much as possible over the last little bit. So I've collected a few examples that we can probably look at together now if you want. If you just need to allow me to share my screen. I think
Oh
you need to
yeah,
make me
yeah. I'll
host
make you the host
so
here.
that I can share my screen.
There you go. So on that point, I completely agree, and I think that's what I do try to tell people is when they get a mock, she's like, just like don't try to interpret the data too much. Just put it on, listen to
Mm-hmm.
your own body, see what the data
Mm-hmm.
is giving back to you, and don't expect to want to know things right away, and don't want to interpret everything into every number. Just kind of see what's happening, because it's
Yeah,
something new.
exactly.
But it's the same. If you give, make the example, probably made this example to you before, but if you give someone a heart rate strap for the very first time, and
Mm-hmm.
they have some kind of idea as to what should be happening, they often, you can get a little flustered because you'll start running and your heart rate lags and you're like, why is my heart rate not going up? And then 2 minutes later, your heart rate's at like 190. You're like, why is my heart rate at 190? And then you'll stop and your heart rate's still at 190. And
Yeah.
then it drops down, you're at 100 and you start running. And then, so, but once you learn to what your body feels like and the response of the signal that you're collecting, you get a
Mm-hmm.
feel, and you get some predictability in what's going to happen, which I think really is important. So I think the point you made is very important, for any Moxy users. Just a week, just put it on for a week, and just go do different things and see how it responds when you do different things, and get a feel for
Mm-hmm.
and then you can start really asking questions. And this is maybe what's a little bit frustrating about the Moxy, is you need this introduction phase, and I'm not quite sure if you can ever really get rid of that, because it is so individual, right?
Mm-hmm.
If it was just like normal, if you could completely have this normalcy, you could maybe create some app that would really guide people from the first moment. But because you are an individual and you're doing individual tasks,
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be some learning curve there, and our job is just to try to make it easier. But I don't think this exploration phase, to a certain extent, I think is going to happen. I think that happens with most
Yeah.
technologies. All right.
It is, and yeah, I was talking to a friend, Dan Jackson, yesterday, and we talked about the Moxy for quite a while, and that was really our conclusion, is that I think it does have the potential to really move the field, in a lot of ways, but that initial phase of understanding, and even on a broader scale, like the email I sent you a couple weeks ago, I also posted the exact same description and graphs on the Moxy forum. You might have seen it there as well, and a Philip answered, and
Yeah.
your answer and Philip's answer weren't the same, right?
Oh, nice.
And we had it. I had Philip
There you
on the
go.
podcast, well, a few days back, and we had a really good chat. I kind of went at him with all my hard questions on the
Good.
SMO2 trend, or like special cases of different trends that we see and why that might be. So he was kind enough to try and answer all those hard questions. But yeah, the what came out of the conversation was really that, like, we need more of these exchanges. We need more
Yeah.
trying to think about those things together, because everybody has their own perspective and thing to bring to the table. And the more we do that, the more we're all going to advance in our understanding of what's
Yeah.
actually going on. So I think it's a very positive thing that we can interact like that. So to give a context to this, because again, context is always super important. I'm using the VO2 Master app. I don't have a VO2 Master at this time, but being on iOS, I have an iPhone. I find that
Yeah.
this is the best way to get data straight to my phone. And then it's nice as well that they aggregate on the graph, on the report side, they already aggregate the SMO2 and the THB data into one graph. All
Yeah.
that's missing is that they add the possibility to have the heart rate in their graph directly, and then you wouldn't have to do any graph manipulation.
Yeah.
But for now, I'm pretty happy with this.
Yeah.
I've got the heart rate on another graph. Sometimes I add it in, but again, then you're copying, pasting, and it looks terrible. And I have the heart rate data over
Yeah.
here anyway.
No,
So
VO2
essentially,
Master
this
guys
was
do a good job.
yeah. So
They do a good job.
it's really cool, and to know that you can add up to 3 sensors into the app. That's really
Yeah.
practical. So
Yeah.
this is great for anybody on iOS looking for a temporary solution while the portal is getting built. This is definitely, I think, the way to go.
Yeah.
So this was me left VL on a bike erg, and they're exactly the same session on a so on a bike erg, what I did was actually there was a tiny difference in the warm up. The second one is 2 days after the first one. So the top one was last Tuesday, I believe, and the bottom one was on either Thursday or Friday of the same week. A very easy warm up to start. I'm just going to pull up the exact warm up that I did to give a bit of context to everybody. So warm up, I did 5 minutes at 100 watts, 1 minute at 150, 2 minutes at 200, 2 minutes at 250. Drag factor was 115 on the bike erg. So that was continuous. So that's the first little part that we see. Let me see if I can pull up a little pen thingy. Can draw. Green is good. Okay, so we have the warm up here, and same here. So first part of the warm up that I just mentioned. Then I got a 2-minute break that you can see here, and oh wait, now it disappeared. How do I get the bar back? Oh, here it is.
There you go.
We've got to move this bar around. Okay, so 2-minute rest right here. Then I did 2 little sprint-ish bouts of 45 seconds. The first one at 440 watts, second one at 550 watts. Same here with 1 minute rest in between. And so that I consider that to be my full warm up. And as we can see here, I'm not quite at max SMO2, which would be here. So I could probably still optimize my warm up a little bit. I think that's probably one of the things I hadn't foreseen, but that is going to come in super handy with the Moxy is optimizing warm up protocols. I think that is, I mean, I guess it's just one other cool thing that you can do with it because there's so many applications for it. People just think about the testing at first, but really the testing is actually a small part of what you can use it for. You can really use it to individualize your warm-up. So here, for example, before those 2 sessions, I'd done a few other ones on the bike erg. I'm coming back from an injury, so keep in mind that I'm not in stellar shape right now, which might explain some of the things that we're going to go through after. But anyway, so getting back on the bike and figuring out what I need to do to get warmed up properly. So here we can see that I still have a little bit of a delta to bridge here. And then second session, that I don't know if that might be because these 2 sprint bouts didn't bring the same stimuli as the first one, due to the fact that I'm fairly untrained right now. And so maybe is that potentially the fact that I've kind of, reacted differently here. I go down to 25% maybe, where here I only go down to 30s here, just about 30, maybe 32, 33%. So I don't know if that might be the fact that, I did the same workout 3 days, one after the other, and the second workout seems to not be as taxing as the first one. So that might be my first interpretation here is that there's already a difference in how I react to the same workout just 3 days apart. And again, it's not a super taxing workout. I did 5 sets. We see them here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sets of 5 minutes at 250 watts with a 2-minute break in between. Full, how to say that, passive rest. And I didn't change anything. My goal with this was to establish a baseline with this session, with this format, and then start playing within that. So maybe playing with increasing speed across the work intervals or decreasing speed across the work intervals to see the different effects on the cardiovascular system, on the respiratory system, stuff that Evan has spoken about in terms of adjusting certain basic protocols to different limitations. So that's kind of what I want to explore down the road with those types of sessions. But things that I can see is, first of all, I don't go as low on the second workout in terms of SMO2. Here you could see that I desatted all the way down to about 20% on the last one. And I'm at 40% on that last one just 2 or 3 days later. So again, I'm sure there's many variables to this, and I'm going to repeat that more times, but it's already interesting to see the difference from one session to the next. You can also see that fairly steep desat here across the interval on the first one, whereas here is flat and here is down to flat. And I don't know to what extent that that speaks to the difficulty or to how ready I was. Again, there's some variation because you can see here 3 and 4 are steeper than 1 and 2 in the second workout, but it's the opposite on the first session. Another thing that I see is the upward trend on the THB here on the almost up to flat. I don't know if you would interpret that like this as well, but you could almost see definitely a trend of a venous occlusion, maybe into an arterial occlusion. And then on that second session, it's flat, and here it's starting to trend up a little bit, but it's only on the last 2, whereas on the first session, it's on the last 3. So is it already that, my body is not being taxed as much for the same amount of work just 3 days later due to the fact that I did the first one? To give context to all of those, I also have heart rate on the first session. I went max heart rate at the end of each interval went from 168 to 181 on the first session, and then second session went from 168, so same, up to 176, down 5 beats at the top of the 5th session. So I don't know to what extent that kind of fits within the margin of error. Minimum SMO2 on all 5 intervals in the first session was 31, 28, 29, 27, 24. And on the second session, 40, 43, 42, 44, 42. So quite a big delta there of about between 15 and 20 points between the first and the second session. Keeping in mind that baseline SMO2 was at about 85 here, and it was maybe just a little bit under 82 or 83 on the second session. And then the last thing that I just realized before is also the THB kind of rebound after the intervals seems to be a little bit higher from 0.5 to 0.9. So 0.4 difference here, and here there's only a 1.15 difference. So quite a bit of a difference here. So that's kind of what I see. Again, there was no particular goal on the session itself. I wanted to repeat that session. Right now I've repeated it twice, but I want to repeat it more down the line to really see from session to session the different variations that there might be. And then from there have a base that I can start modifying and playing with to see the different reactions. So I don't know if you want to maybe throw your thoughts on what I just put forward and what you think.
Yeah, so you put forward a lot. And so no, not at all. I mean, there's a lot here. It's interesting, right? And this is, we always need to be a little, we can always interpret data in lots of different ways. And we always need to be a little bit careful. And I'm all for explorative interpretation of data. So I'm not against that, but I'm also, generally, in the end, I think I'm a scientist, so I need to be somewhat objective. So what I always try to tell people when they look at data, like the first thing you need to do is like, okay, let's look at SMO2. Let's go to that. And let's think about what does the SMO2 signal tell us? It tells us 2 things. So one, it tells us about oxygen supply and demand balance in the way that the slope changes. And the other thing it tells us is about the oxygen reserve, right? So that's kind of where you are on that scale. So one thing that you point out very nicely is that, well, at rest, at these peak rest intervals that you have, at least, let's ignore the warm-up for now, they're pretty similar. They're between 80 and 85. So that's negligible. So basically, your rest levels of circulating oxygen there, the saturation, those are kind of equal. But what the big change is in these minimums. So how far you're desaturating down to. That's a big delta that we see. So basically, what we're saying is that you're extracting less oxygen in the muscles. Now, because it's a balance between oxygen supply to a certain extent, there's a couple different things that can be happening. So either you're really supplying a whole bunch more, so you're extracting the same amount, let's say, but because you're supplying a whole bunch more, there's just more available to you, even though you're extracting the same amount. Or you're actually extracting less. Those are probably the 2 main options that are happening. And so the fact that your heart rate was lower the second time, and the fact that if you look at your THB spikes, which talk about something about blood volume to actually kind of drop off in each of these breaks, right? They kind of peak up, but there you may be looking at, or at least I would argue, less likely that you're all of a sudden bringing way more oxygen into the system than you were before. It's much more likely that your ability to extract oxygen at the muscular level has somehow changed. And one thing that happen is fatigue causes that. Okay, so if you're tired, that causes that. Now, I don't know if you're tired or not. So this would be context what you did between. How taxing is this? How taxing was this bout on Tuesday when you did this on Thursday? If you say that you're
I would say
untrained,
they were about the same. I didn't feel a huge difference. I didn't feel more fatigued on the second one. So I was wondering if that delta in SMO2 usage might just be from an efficiency standpoint, if that makes sense. Like I can extract less but still do the same amount of work. I don't know if that can be inferred from the lowest point SMO2 on the first and the second one, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so they're constant work rates. Like all the work rate on all of them are the same, right? It's always
250 across the board.
250 watts, yeah. So that would be something. You would have a very quick change in efficiency in 3 days.
That's what I was wondering. Is that actually the case, or is it something else? Yeah.
So there's some physiological changes that happen quickly. So what does happen quickly is, for example, a loss of extraction capacity. That can happen very quickly. So there's lots of studies on that. So if I fatigue my local muscles, I can do that very quickly. And then I have very drastic effects on muscle oxygenation in a very short time frame. That's why that's generally, whereas anything that's like, it could be, the other option is also that you have a fatiguing of your central nervous system. Central nervous system is the wrong term, of your central system. So say your heart is tired from work that you did. And then it's kind of like what with Dempsey, it's the same. It's like, or if your respiratory muscles are tired, then these reflexes kicked in that basically lower your overall performance output to protect central mechanisms, like the respiratory system.
Sorry to cut you off, Angie.
No, it's
considering that the workloads are exactly the same, wouldn't we see an increase in RPE at least? If that was the case, if there was additional fatigue and an essential, let's say that the central components were fatigued and maybe inhibited to some extent for protection purposes. Same thing with the peripheral stuff. In that case, if I can't extract properly, when that results at the same workload in a high RPE, which again it wasn't. So that's why I'm asking the question.
No, and I completely agree. You would assume that is like that. From my experience, it would also be that case. But it also goes the other way around. If you were to say I increased my efficiency, you would assume a drop in RPE.
Yeah.
So if you were,
which wasn't the case either.
I felt significantly better, then I'd be like, okay. Well, I mean, you can get something that can happen rather quickly is things like plasma expansion. So like you can with hard training, you can increase blood volume to a certain extent. But I don't think this is the case here. To why that is exactly happening.
Okay.
One thing, but I mean, what is happening? So you have a lower heart rate, okay, which goes into your direction of things are easier, okay. What we're missing here is it could be that you have a lower heart rate and a higher stroke volume, so you're pushing more blood with your heart, and this goes into the direction of maybe this kind of idea of having plasma expansion. Again, I think the time frame is probably too short, but that you have more volume of blood that you're pumping, and it's easier to pump because plasma expansion makes it more watery, so it's less viscous, so it's easier to pump, so your heart rate comes down. But because there's more volume, your stroke volume goes up, and all of a sudden you're more effectively pumping blood through the system.
That's the magic variable that we don't have access to, right? That cardiac output. or that is, I guess, yeah, the extraction volume, or help me here, ejection fraction or
Yeah,
ejection.
yeah,
Yeah,
or like your preload values and stroke volume and all those other cardiac, because heart rate's a very small part of what that is.
it's like, yeah, it's like respiratory rate without tidal volume, right? It's like
Yeah,
one of the
which,
two
and I
things
even
that
think
we need.
even more, like I think it's even more than that. Like I think cardiac stroke volume is even a bigger component than tidal volume.
Interesting.
But maybe I'm biased towards cardiac functions. Um, yeah, so I mean that could be so, but it's not. So with everything that you're saying in the context you're putting it in, if I saw this picture, I would say, well, you're tired, but you say that you're not tired and the work rates are the same. And then any improvements that you're attributing here, I think, again, it's a pretty short time frame.
Yeah, I was wondering if there might be like almost like an acute rebound of some physiological stuff due to the session on the Tuesday. Given the fact that it's probably the most intense session that I've done in recent weeks and even months.
Yeah.
I built up to that with some the one I did before those, like the week before, was kind of in a pyramid fashion, where I did 200 watts on the first one, then 225, 250, and then back down 25 and 200. So yeah, I was wondering if maybe it wasn't, kind of a full-blown adaptation, but maybe just a quick response from the system being like, oh, so now we need this to be working better. And then in the following days, maybe it works better. But again, that was totally speculative on my end. I don't know.
I mean, so without knowing, but I completely agree with you on is that if your legs were really, I mean, this is a big difference in desaturation. And if your legs were really tired, I think you would have noticed it with a substantially higher RPE. I don't think you would have felt the same. So it is.
Breathing frequency was down a bit too on the second one. I have no valid way of measuring that, so I just counted my breaths on the last 30 seconds of each interval.
Yeah.
And on average, on the first session, I was at 44, and then 40 on the second session on average. I didn't write them down for each interval, but I thought it might be one more thing to bring to the table if I had that.
Okay, so you're breathing less rapidly. I mean, I do think a lot of that stuff does point to maybe your argument of increased efficiency. Your heart rate's down, your RPE, again, at least isn't up.
No.
Your muscle oxygen, you have more muscle oxygen available to you for the same given workload. If your respiration rate's also down, that all is points more towards your argument of some kind of improvement. Now, it's difficult to assess what is it truly cycling efficiency? Is there some physiological rebound, like you said, some kind of compensation that already happened? What's for sure is that whatever you did on Tuesday, or what you did on Tuesday, wasn't fatiguing enough to affect or not likely, or doesn't seem to be, because I think you would have more of a subjective feeling of that. Again, so, I mean, subjectivity is always a little weird. RPs are always communal, but they're actually not that bad. I mean, over enough. I mean, some people are off on RPs, but generally speaking, people aren't that bad on RPs.
I guess one way to solve this, or to some extent, would just be to repeat it a couple more times, at least over the next couple weeks, and then see if the reactions are more in line with the second one, or more in line with the first one, or somewhere in between. If they go up and down over time, that's another thing that I wanted to do, is just be super boring and do the exact workout, like maybe twice a week for like a month, and then just for research and of one purposes of seeing, okay, how much variation do I see from session to session, and can I tie that to anything concrete? But again, I need to do more of those to be able to tell.
Yeah, and so yeah, and maybe one comment is too, is like on the THB scaling. That there's a much more higher rebound in the second one. Now, I do think we need to be a little bit careful of that, because that's all fairly arbitrary, like the units on that. And comparing it within one session is different than comparing between sessions on scaling that is arbitrary. So what's sure is they both go up, so they're both increasing. But comparing the magnitudes between these two, we need to be a little bit more careful about, because apart from the magnitude change, I think they actually look somewhat similar, and I think the major difference is actually in your sprints. That you tend to have you get more of an increasing trend during your like post warm up, which maybe speaks to, let's call it cardiac efficiency. I don't know if that's the proper term, but the ability to have, maybe to back it up a bit. So THB changes if our Moxy's measuring capillary blood, which it should be to the majority of signal, but there's some debate on that. It talks about how many capillaries you've recruited, so how many are open, which is also one of the things with like this vasodilation, vasoconstriction thing. So capillaries don't vasodilate or vasoconstrict; they just open or close. So they're affected by vasodilation and vasoconstriction at the bigger blood vessels on the outside, but where we're measuring actually is not a vasodilation or vasoconstriction. But they open or close, you recruit more of them. So it would, and to be able to recruit more, that something has to do with blood pressure that you have available to you to open up more blood vessels. So it looks like maybe, you do have some better cardiac response and you're able to open more blood vessels up overall. Which would talk about, like, you probably have a higher stroke volume happening, your heart rate's a little bit lower, and that the system is maybe working a little bit more, let's use your term, efficiently. I don't know if this actually helped you that much, okay, with interpreting the data.
That's one thing that I wasn't sure about, is how is it fair? Is it correct to compare THB, like you said, magnitude changes from one session to the next? And I guess that is a little bit harder to go to. Do you see anything on those trends during the intervals, where I pointed out the potential venous occlusion into an arterial occlusion on the last two intervals of the first session, and then possibly something a little bit more delayed on the second session? What do you see anything there, or is it too small a change to tell?
Yeah, so I mean, this is also one of the so if it's I'm always a little bit hesitant with things like in cycling. So these occlusion patterns, I think they're true if I do isometric contractions. There's almost certainly occlusions that are happening. And I can measure those with the Moxy, because the occlusion that's happening at the venous or arterial level is going to affect the capillaries that I recruit, and the blood volume available in those. But you have to think of your cycling, and cycling, if you put EMG on your leg and you look at muscle activity, it's not constant load. So you have muscle contraction, you have muscle relaxation. This in itself generates pumping of blood. Right.
Up to a certain point, if I'm not mistaken, right? I mean, I watched, and that's just on the back end of watching. Did you watch Stuart's presentation from the 2020 summit, where he talks about a coordination approach to interpreting Moxy data?
Yeah. So I was at the summit. I'm not sure if I remember all the details of his.
Essentially, he talked about this study, and I haven't had a chance to pull up the paper yet, where somebody was on a recumbent bike. They were at rest at first, and the cuff was applied to the thigh, only one thigh, the left thigh, I think. And the time of let's say contraction on the cuff started at 300 milliseconds, and I'm not sure what the interval was between contractions. And then it progressively went up 300, 600, 900 milliseconds. And then as soon as it passed that threshold between 900 and 1,000 milliseconds, then you started to see O2 being affected, SMO2 being affected. But with the prior, let's say, compression durations, there was actually an increase in SMO2. And then they did that on people cycling as well. There was one group at 50, one group at 100 watts. There was a control, and then another group where they applied the cuff pressure. And same thing, there was, depending on which wattage they were at and the duration of the contraction with the cuff or the added compression of the cuff to the cycling motion already, there was different patterns of SMO2 trends, but that kind of made sense in terms of it was all adding up together, which kind of tended to paint the picture that if you can coordinate your kind of contraction relaxation cycles well enough, you can still bring enough blood in, but then at some point you're going to start cutting blood flow in one way or another if you can't coordinate, or if the contraction to relaxation ratio, if that's even a thing, isn't favorable enough anymore. I don't know if that makes any sense, and I might have misunderstood the paper or the study, but it sounded really interesting in terms of understanding the effect of compressions on the muscle itself, and venous return and preload and cardiac output in turn, although that kind of cycle. Yeah. I don't know if that makes any sense to you, if I understood it properly.
No, I mean, I'm not sure if you understood it properly, in the sense that I haven't read the paper, so I can't judge if you did or not. But I'm just going off with what you said. Yeah. So if you're putting a cuff on, you're going to generate occlusion, but we're talking about I'm assuming there's something in what you said that would infer that people are creating enough venous pressure that would reduce blood outflow during cycling. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the argument that's made when we talk about venous occlusions. Mm-hmm. And that without a cuff. I mean, if you put a cuff on, it doesn't take that much cuff pressure to generate a venous occlusion. That has all to do with, though, that it's continuous pressure. It
wasn't. It was a pulsating cuff. So
it was a pulsating cuff. See?
Yeah, sorry, I might have not been precise enough. And so it was the contraction time between the relax. And again, I don't know how long the lapse was between the dynamic contractions of the cuff, but they started with a shorter time scale, 300 milliseconds, and they went all the way up to 1,000 milliseconds. And you could see differences as the steps went up. Essentially, up to a certain point, it was beneficial, as in you could see SMO2 trend going up. Yeah. But then essentially, if you compounded the compressions from the cycling itself and the wattage that they were at, plus the compressions of the cuff, the dynamic added compressions of the cuff, then you saw that this added value had an effect on SMO2. And essentially, the group that was at a higher wattage, we started seeing a downward trend in SMO2 sooner, I think at the 600 millisecond scale, compared to the people that were at 50 watts, if that makes any sense. But I'll send you
that's a little bit difficult, because I mean, if you have different wattage outputs, that you're going to have different. I mean, just the fact that you have a different energy demand is you would need to separate it. You would need to have that response happening at the same. But I'd have to look at the paper. You need to have the response happening at the same performance output, so you don't affect the demand of oxygen, because you just want to get the effect on the supply of oxygen, not on the demand, right? If you're changing the demand up, then the whole thing kind of gets tossed out. So
I'll send you that after. I'll dig up the paper and I'll send it to you. We can discuss it at another time when I've understood it properly and when you've had a chance to look at
it. Yeah. So if the assumption is that your 250 watts cycling generates enough venous pressure, despite the fact that you're contracting and uncontracting muscles, which has a pump effect, but let's say it's uncoordinated. So you somehow have some constant. I wonder if they did EMG in that study, because that would be the point, right? You see if there's constant contraction or not. Then these type of trends look like what a venous occlusion trend would look like, that in the fact that it goes up, right? But I mean, what's also a little bit confounding here is that what is also happening, without a doubt, is that as soon as you start this, you are also increasing heart rate.
Yeah.
Which is increasing blood flow. So now you have this increase in blood volume, which we see here with these up green trends. And we're saying, well, this could be a venous occlusion because it's going up, which means I'm reducing outflow. It could also just be in general more inflow because your heart rate's going up again.
Since the load is constant, wouldn't we then see, and since the load is constant and since heart rate is going up on each at the start of each interval, wouldn't we see that on the earlier intervals as well, on number 1 and 2? And where you can see on one, especially on the first one, on both sessions, the trend is down, is not up. And then the second one is clearly flat, and the third one flat on the second session, but upwards on the first one.
Yeah, that might have to do with the physiological response to the sessions beforehand. So things like the first session with high intensity is going to change the biochemical milieu of the muscle. So you can have changes in, you can have decreases in increases in ADP and AMP. You're going to have change in creatine phosphate levels and in pH. All those things affect things like blood flow, vasodilation in the big blood vessels, capillary recruitment. So if that's progressively happening, then over time, you get an advantage at the local level as a result of the metabolism. The system's trying to survive, which goes into the fact that in the second bout on Thursday, you get this kind of response within the bout of a positive increase in, let's say, blood volume availability later because your whole system may be working better. We said, right? So it takes more bouts now for that biochemical change to basically take effect within the bout, maybe.
Okay, cool.
Do you see? Yeah, maybe you see that.
That makes sense.
See that happening. What you also have is, if we're going to go with these like recovery peaks, is that you actually have your 2 highest peaks in THB, which if we're talking this blood volume, are in the first 2, or like the ones that you've highlighted with the green on top. So these ones, and then it drops off, but the ones following that actually stabilize or even go up again.
Yeah, I see that.
See what I mean? And those are in joint with the within session increases. Do you see what I mean?
Is that kind of what you see?
Yeah, right. And so the 2 flat within sessions are followed by these within session increases, which have resting peaks that stabilize and increase again. So the whole system blood volume is kind of stabilizing itself, probably because of a change of some kind of biochemical reactions. Whereas you have that a little bit less. So if you look at the top one, you have it goes down, 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 and maybe on this last one it comes up again, right? So the fact and the within session increases start earlier. Do you see what I mean at all? You can say if you don't see it, then we can discuss it. But it has to all to with the recruitment of capillaries and how you open capillaries, which have to do with these high intensity bouts, which are resulting in changes in your cellular, the biochemical milieu to again AMP, ADP levels, which are all increasing blood flow and capillarization or capillary recruitment. That's probably how I would interpret this most likely, rather than venous occlusions happening. Now that doesn't. I know lots of people make that argument. My dad makes this argument often. I'm just not. I have trouble in cycling. I mean, I don't know how much wattage you can push maximally, but probably 1,000 watts if you were to like do one hard kick, like I'm going now.
On the bike erg, just thinking back to the peaks that I did in the end of the warm up, where it was at 550, probably touched 600. I don't think that. I think 1,000 is a little far, especially in my state at this point. I think I'd be closer to probably upwards of 800, maybe 50, 900 maybe. But I'm not 100% sure.
So if we go conservatively and say 750, let's say 750 is your cycling MVC. 250 will be then 33% of that. And generally speaking, now you can't take this one-to-one. Cycling is a lot more coordination to it. So that's the argument that you were making, which could be fair, right? With contractions and co-contractions and loss of coordination that might result in this getting bogged down more. But purely on what we know about blood flow and MVC is that it's like, Romer slots like 50, 60%, you start affecting blood flow considerably, and you're a ways off that. And there's even some studies that I can show you that say you're still getting flow at upwards of 80% of MVC, that you're never really completely stopping it. I think that's maybe it's not quite as mainstream, but there are some studies that show that. That's why I'm always, if we're talking about these occlusion trends in strength training, things like that, I'm there because I think that's very reproducible. In cycling, I'm only there if I can't explain it in a different way. Then I'm like, oh, maybe it's that. But right now, I think it's more reasonable to assume that these increases are due to increased blood volume change because of increased blood flow and cardiac effort, rather than venous occlusions. But maybe this is where me and Phil would disagree. So, like you said,
that's why, like, again, that's why those exchanges are important, and that people see that there's more than one way to see things, and there's still underlying physiological mechanisms that need to be maybe clarified for everybody to be on the same page on those things, I guess.
Yeah, but so maybe to bring it back, because I mean, you can get bogged down in this, and I don't want people to get like scared of, oh my God, we don't even know interpreting, right? I mean, that's a realistic problem. I mean, it's really no different than if you have a couple people talk about blood lactate values. It can go haywire too, because you can see a lot of different things in the different ways you want to interpret blood lactate values. For sure.
Exactly. Did you want me to bring up another one? I've got
you can bring up another one for sure. But
this got a bit of time.
This is something I've talked about, that I focus a lot more on SMO2 than I do on THB. I have more confidence in that measure. We've talked about that before.
That makes sense.
It's fun to talk about THB as well, obviously.
Okay, so that was the first one. I just need to erase everything. Erase all this. And then I've got two more, but tell me which one you think would be the most interesting. I've got one.
We can do them both. Like if it's just interesting for you in general to talk about, we can talk about it. Like, this doesn't all have to be for a YouTube video. It's just
you can put it all out there. I'm cool with that. It's more content for you. It's more content for the people. I think that's always a good thing. Again, let me just erase that. So here, what's interesting is that it's a similar session. I won't say exactly the same, but it's a similar session, but two different people. So they're both on a rower, both right vastus lateralis, and they're both repeat sprints with the full recovery. And the biggest thing that just jumps out at me is just the THB trend, which is completely different from one person to the next. We could probably see, if I'll annotate the graph just a little bit, we probably
is
see.
Is there a big power difference? Is one much stronger, or are they performance-wise
similar? No, they're pretty close on what they were pushing on those sprints. They were down to the 130s on the rower, which is about 450 watts or just above that, I believe. And so they were both pretty close. This one goes down fairly low. You could see he's in the tens, maybe even a little bit below. I think he might have gone to like 9 or 8% at the bottom, whereas the other one is stuck a little bit higher, but here went down to about 25, and then the other ones were more around 30% SMO2. So that's a pretty significant difference. I did a 515 with the first gentleman here, and that's actually the one I sent you where he could only go down to 65, 60% SMO2 even on the harder intervals towards the end, and even on the Wingate after 5-minute rest, he was only down to 45 or 55 even percent, I believe. So and he doesn't have any significant amount of fat mass. So because we talked about this by email, right? If you have more than 1.5 millimeters of skin plus fat, then it becomes problematic to interpret the magnitude of change or the actual scale of the SMO2, if I remember correctly, right? Yeah. But yeah, so we have for both people here, but that was still warm up to about here, and for this one it was I believe those were probably still part of the warm up. So we probably go to here. So yeah, five intervals, 6 intervals for the second one here. And yeah, similar DSAT trends. Obviously, it's going down really fast because they're going fast, and then it's rebounding and going back to baseline. This gentleman's baseline is obviously a little bit higher here in the high 80s, whereas this one is stuck a little bit lower in the mid 60s. We could see with a little bit more rest, he goes up towards the 72, 73 mark, but he's still a little bit lower in comparison. But again, we're between different people, so it's not necessarily that important. But yeah, the thing that really jumps out is the difference in THB, where at the bottom it's straight. And then, yeah, for context, the last piece here at the end was a steady state at a low intensity, with a goal to keep SMO2 flat. Just to finish the session and gather some more information. And you could see again the gentleman at the bottom, the THB is pretty much flat the whole way through the session, whereas the other one is very much following the SMO2 trend on the sprints. And then even on this very low intensity row at the end here, he was really tired, and he said it. And even this very, very quote unquote recovery row was too much for him, but he could see possibly a big compression. And then I guess those are all the little strokes that you can see here, but you can see blood coming back up to the previous level, which is something that you had pointed out when we had exchanged by email, that it didn't look like a venous occlusion necessarily. A venous occlusion necessarily, because we were really just going back to the same level as we were before in terms of volume here and here. So I think that's what I have to see at first glance. I'm curious to see what you think between those two people. What's going on with the THB?
Yeah. I mean, this is one of those difficulties with THB, right? So, you would get two people, they would do this, and then I would have to I'd be like, hey, what's going to happen with SMO2? I'd be like, oh, well, the interval is just going to drop down significantly. It's going to come back up. It's going to drop down. It does that with both people exactly the same way. So I can predict it. Now I can't predict how low it's going to go. Those are individual capacities, or how quickly it recovers, or how quickly it descends. Those are the individual capacities that we interpret to do assessments on athletes. But now if I had to interpret THB, I would have assumed it would look more like the top one than the bottom one. And I would be dead wrong in the bottom one. So obviously there's something going on there that I didn't necessarily know beforehand. So one of the questions that I think I have would be, what does the heart rate look like? Do you have heart rate data for these guys?
I do. I'd have to pull it up. Let me
the question is how quickly is heart rate, because it'll go up during the bout and it'll go down. How quickly is heart rate going up or down? So maybe the top guy has significantly more change in heart rate. So it'll go, it'll go 180, 130, 180, 130, whereas the other guy's just basically flat lines at 180 the whole time.
So that's the heart rate. Let me see if I can. What do you see now? Do you still see the same graph?
Yeah, I still see the same graph.
Okay, so let me switch my screen share. New share. Where are we? Report here.
So report. One of the other things that often we discussed was these like more drastic changes in DHB, something having to do with the strength of contractions, right? This has to do with these compressions, outflow, inflow things, right? So the argument would be that the top guy just has these stronger contractions that are happening.
Yeah, so that's the heart rate. That's the heart rate for the gentleman that has a flat THB here.
Okay, it goes up quite a bit too. It's like 100, 150, like, and
yeah. So here we've got
So that's got pretty
heart
strong.
rate.
It's like 175 or something like that, and it goes down to like 110 or 120. So it's kind of they're like 50 point jumps, something like that.
Yeah, right about that, I would say. Something like that. So that's for the first gentleman. Do you want me to pull up the other one too, just so we can see?
No, that's. I mean, I was just wondering if that guy was basically like going between 180 and 170, because then you'd have some kind of constant flow with just like the heart rate's never recovering. So let's say the heart is just constantly going and going and going, and then that would be an explanation as to why THB just stays like that, because it's just always. It's always and the other guy, but that doesn't look like it's the case. I would have been amazed if that was the case, but it's just for it's something. I mean, like you've seen some sports with very short intervals, heart rate never actually comes down again. It just stays up and up and up. So, what's interesting though is that generally speaking, lower SMO2 values, SMO2 mins, are correlated with higher performance. So this is true for like things like VO2 peak, but it's also generally true for isometric contractions as well. So the ability to come down and extract lower is correlated with higher performances. So you would then assume that if this THB thing is happening because of stronger contractions, it would be associated with the lower desaturation values. But in this, it isn't. It's the reverse, right? So that's why I'm not sure if the idea of saying, well, the bottom guy just doesn't contract as hard and the top guy maybe I'm not sure if that's the case. I mean, these are always relative, right? MVC, like the effect of contractions on compression forces are somewhat relative to the individual. So you can't completely say it. But I don't think that what we're looking at right now would really support that being the actual case here. One thing is also, like we said before, is that I mean, if you were to like really change scale this, maybe you would see something similar to the top, and we say, well, the problem is with the scaling. But generally at Moxy, we say a 0.1 change is a change in your actual THB value. So you have more or less blood volume. Whereas here, you basically have the same. There is absolutely
0.8 to 0.9 the whole way through.
There's nothing happening. So there's no impediment to blood volume change at all. Yeah, I don't know. Actually, I think I'd have to think about it more. But I've seen these cases before, and as you can see, I still don't have a good answer for them.
Well, it's always interesting.
So the compression ones are ones that are used. I know that, but I'm not always so sold that those are actually super valid. I mean, they'd be valid if a few details were different, I could make that argument. But the fact that you can't always make that argument means that you're probably not right in the argument that you make. Or
that makes sense. That's a new one here. It's the same graph as the gentleman on the bottom before at the top.
Hey, you should. Sorry, one second. You should put some of these example on the backer forum, because I think people will be interested. And then we could get input from Evan and Phil, because I would be interested in how, if they make the argument for compression inflow outflow, I'd be interested in how they make those arguments, because I'm not convinced.
Cool. We could probably post those. I could post those graphs attached to raw data, because I know they always like to see that, and then post the link to that video if you publish it in full. That way they could refer back to our conversation and see what we talked about. So that's the same person this time. Similar session. So again, a warm up into some repeat sprints. This one is from 2 or 3 weeks back, and then the one at the bottom is from yesterday, actually. First thing, you could see that he pulled lower on those on that first session, so down to 30 here, even to 25. Second session here, he was kind of stuck just below. It was at 38, I believe, and then 40. and then you got to 35, 36, and 34, if I remember correctly. Wattage was about the same as on the first session, so around 450, 460 watts on the rower. My biggest question here is on the back end. So full recovery here after the last one. He took about 3 or 4 minute rest, I guess from here to here. So yeah, probably about 4 or 5 minutes, 4 minutes. And then he got back on, and I told him to row super easy, and we could see the start of the row from the GHB here, where it goes down. But this just stayed. It just stayed at 91, I believe, and wouldn't budge. And I got him to put 4 or 5 strokes a little bit harder, and it still didn't budge. So I don't know if fatigue from he was pretty tired after this session. He's not used to this kind of work. So I'm wondering if this might have impeded his ability to even use any oxygen at all by the end of the session, which is kind of what we could maybe even see here, is that he was able at the start of that easy steady state to use some, but then he went back up, and then he kind of flatlined up here in the 90s as well. So I wanted to get your point of view on that, especially that last part, because it's I don't know, it doesn't make a ton of sense to me. So I don't know if you can say anything about that.
Yeah. So I actually think this is maybe the least confusing one of all of them. So, but maybe not. And it just has to do with, so like you said, there's good data to support that if you do fatiguing sessions, that your ability to desaturate decreases. So assuming these are fatiguing sessions, that would be 0.1. The second point is that you have drastically changed the muscular environment by doing these intense sessions, and you've definitely stimulated the cardiovascular system to pump blood. And so all that together with let's say decreased oxygen extraction and increased oxygen supply, it would make sense that you have high values.
Okay. But even to the point of having high plateaued values like this?
So I mean, the high plateau. So I mean, it's a little different when you say I made him do 5 hard strokes and it didn't come down. Like, did he do 5 hard strokes and then he was like, I'm done, I can't do anymore?
No, he did 5 a little bit harder. It wasn't like sprint strokes, but it was definitely something that would have shown some kind of decrease, at least in. It was probably like a start of the warm up kind of pace that he was starting to hit with those 5 strokes.
Yeah.
Or even so kind of here, but that didn't result in anything. But again, I guess you could look at, and I don't know if that's the thing that is done, but look at those two together here, and then those two together here. There was quite a shift in total oxygenated hemoglobin. I don't know if that's even a calculation that is fair to do, but I don't know if that has an impact. Obviously, if there's a lot more there, then using a little bit is not going to show as much as before, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so that's definitely the case. So with the percentages, is that the percentages are relative. So 10% of a lot is more than 10% of a little. So that is an argument. So when I say the cardiovascular system's working better, and the change in the muscle happened because of the biochemical changes, and there's more blood all around, that would encompass the comment that you just made, that you have more oxygen available. So lower percentage changes mean actually more oxygen consumption, and you've already potentially decreased the ability to consume oxygen as well, right? This is also where things are interesting. This is the VL. What's happening in the rest? So maybe the VL is toasted, so you're getting like no response. So the entire performance that you're outputting now is actually happening elsewhere. So you've changed technique because you have a task, right? Your task is I have to row, and I'm not a rower. So, but this happens. I mean, you see it with runners, and they fatigue and they start running differently than they did before. So different muscle groups start getting involved in trying to complete the task at hand, because we have lots of redundancies.
Yeah. That's something that Stuart showed quite clearly in his presentation of the 2020 summit. He
Yeah,
puts up to 14 Moxies on people and tries
yeah.
to look at everything that's going on, and it's clear that not everything responds the same all the time. That's definitely a thing.
Yeah, so that it could be, so you think, well, there's like nothing happening here, and that might very well be by design. Like the VL, there's nothing going to happen in the VL, but
Mm,
you change your upper body techniques, you can still, and I don't know, you're using more hip extension things, more lower
mm,
back. Again, I'm not a rowing coach, but and then what it results in, all these factors come in together, that you have decreased oxygen consumption in the VL, you have a change in muscle recruitment to generate the performance that you still have to perform, but you still have an increased cardiac output happening, and you pool all
mm,
those together, and all of a sudden you have these high oxygenation values, and even if you do a couple kicks, not that much happening.
mm,
This is where it would be like, so if you put EMG on, would be with that kick, you have a much lower EMG response, for example, than you did at the beginning on the same muscle with the
mm.
exact same kick.
Yeah, that makes so yeah, and I mean from that reaction or lack thereof, I decided to stop. Right, I didn't get him to go through with the 15 or 20 minutes that I put him on
Yeah,
at the end, because if nothing is happening, then I guess that's where auto regulation comes in, and you can say, well, he's not able to actually perform the work, physiologically that we're trying to apply, and so that's probably a good time to call it and not just beat the dead horse.
yeah, but no. Let's say if this happened after a warm up. Okay, so
Mm,
ignore all the fatiguing effects,
okay.
and you
Yeah.
had this happen. Then you would have the exact same picture happen after the warm up. It's going to warm up, and you get this thing going on, and the guy feels great. Now it's you want to, this is like a golden workout today, we're pushing it today,
Mm,
he feels
mm,
awesome. Now we got to go with this, you got to go and go and go, right? Because now it's a whole different situation, that the body is like super revved and you're going and the guy feels great. And
mm,
obviously you're delivering oxygen like mad, right? So assuming then if you did kicks, you'd be able to get it to come down, but the assumption would be it's at a higher power output than normally, that you get this
mm,
decrease to happen, because
mm.
your capacity is higher today. So
You're
it'd be
you're
a
maybe better
super
primed, or if that's even a
whatever,
word
yeah.
to
Then
use.
just a
Yeah.
super good training session day. You're like good to go. We
Yeah.
got to utilize
Yeah.
today.
Mm,
Um, Whereas in this way, you were like stopped it, and that's probably a good idea, because technique's probably crap, and you're not really going to get a good training session in. But I mean, well, you
yeah.
did all this stuff before, but there's no point in continuing it. Let's put it that way.
Mm, mm. Cool.
I think
I
that's
think
definitely
that
the case. But I think I
yeah,
need to
I
look
had
I need to look at Stuart's presentation again, and I need to go read that study. I know I remember a study maybe like that, but it's
mm,
not. That wasn't coming to mind with the pulsating, Yeah,
cuff.
if yeah. Um,
There was one last one I wanted to quickly look at with you if you have a
yeah,
couple
of course.
minutes, and that's let me just switch shared screens. Here we go. So this has to be by far the most boring session I've ever done. Uh,
Nice.
it's bike erg, left VL again for me, because I'm a lefty. And so essentially my idea was that I just thought, hey, let's do like a what Daniel would call a zone 2 session. So you have a balance of delivery and utilization. So kind of a flat SMO2 curve or a flat trend. And I didn't do any warm up at the start. I did a really easy start at about, I can't write with this thing, but that's about 80 watts. And then I progressively went up to about 120, and I sat on 120 for most of it. And then towards the end, I had to maintain that SMO2 between 48 and 52. I had to go down closer to about 112 watts to just finish on the same. If I'd stayed at 120, that would probably have gone up a bit. Oh, sorry, down a bit here.
Yeah.
And so my biggest question with that was, when you're doing a zone 2 session like this and you want to stay at a balanced delivery and utilization state, do you want to do a full-blown warm up prior to get baseline SMO2 much higher to start, knowing that I can get into the low 80s with a good warm up, and from that point maybe go down to like a 65 or 70%. Like, my question really is, what is the right level to stay at on a steady state session? How do you pick your percentage SMO2, or do you go by power, or how do you decide where you're going to sit with that flat line for a balanced kind of session like that?
Yeah. So I think the most important point, and you did this correctly, is that if you're doing like an endurance zone, so whatever zone number you want to give that session, it's the steady state is the most important component of that. So and so if you start having decreases, then you have to lower performance, which is what you did, and you maintain a steady state. Now, the it's not just steady state though. Like you say, the percentage actually then matters, because you can get a steady state if at very, very low values at very, very, very high intensities.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm asking.
Which is
because you could say, yeah, I did a steady state session at 15% for an hour. Felt great.
Yeah. Which is like so VO2 like max sessions, these kind of they will look like steady state sessions at very low SMO2s, where you're just cranking VO2 max, like you're trying to as high, right? So you're doing like five times 5 minutes, where you're just like rolling at like critical power, and you're just maximizing VO2, and your SMO2 values can be very, very low. Obviously, that's not endurance. This is one of the where endurance and VO2, while they're related, they're not actually the same. I actually want to make a video with this at some time, because we have some data from my dad with this ultra marathon runner guy, and he never got very low SMO2 values, which is what's correlated with high VO2s. Now his VO2 was pretty high because he was just crazy, but it wasn't super high. And there is good data to support that it's not a perfect correlation, that endurance, that there's a separation between endurance and VO2. And that likely has to do with that endurance has to a certain degree also like components of like substrate utilization. So a lot of VO2 maxes happen at high intensities, where you're using lots and lots of glycogen and glucose, which would, and it's not this like fat burning thing. So, whereas if you're doing long endurance things, it's much more about utilizing fat properly and efficiently. Okay, but that again doesn't happen at the high VO2 levels. So it would then also be to assume that if you're doing an endurance training and your goal isn't VO2, so if increasing VO2 is often the most effective way of doing it is actually doing high intensity work. Now that plateaus out at high level athletes, but if you have low to moderate level athletes and you would like, I want to increase VO2, you might as well just do high intensity work. There's lots of studies that show it does a much better job at doing that. But if you want to increase endurance, which isn't the same as VO2, it has more to do with you want to make sure that they utilize fat effectively as well as a different energy source that's available to them. I mean, that has to happen at lower intensities. Okay. And so one of the things that is if you give people extra oxygen, so you do like hyperoxia, when the oxygen contents are high, their glucose and glycogen utilization goes down, their lactate production goes down, and their fat utilization goes up. Now, if you follow that logic, it would say more oxygen available, better fat utilization, which would mean if I'm going to do an endurance training with the goal of I'm burning fat, so I'm doing an endurance training, goal is fat burning, then I actually want to do my endurance at the highest oxygen saturation level that I can achieve and have some kind of steady state going on. Okay. And there's probably going to be a little bit of a mixed balance between having high enough performance, because you don't want to do it at like 30 watts. So you want to maximize oxygen saturation for performance. And there's going to be some product of that where maybe you're not at the absolute highest oxygen saturation that you could get to, but you've upped performance enough that you have more metabolism turnover, which is probably going to benefit that substrate, because there's going to be more stimulus.
So it probably would be a good idea to do a warm up and then and then do an easy session on the back end, because then the system would just be in a better state to begin with, and then the session might be more productive. Does that make sense?
Yeah, right. You had a question. Yeah. It's, well, I mean, I just did a bunch of blab and didn't ask your question. Yeah. So I would say you're better off doing a warm up and tracking how your system responds, right? But what I was trying to say before, it's not like, so if you warm up and you get up to 80, right? So you warm up at 80 watts and you get to 80 oxygen saturation. And then you're like, okay, I'm going to go up to 100, 120, 110. And then it drops down to 70, like you were saying. It's probably not beneficial to go back to 80. Maybe it is, but I would argue that it's not. You're better off at staying at the 120 with the higher, but having the level, trying to push that up a little bit higher. And seeing how that responds. That's what I would do if your goal is endurance training.
Yeah, so what I'll probably do is repeat the exact same session with a standardized warm-up that I've used in even the interval sessions to get my SMO2 to 80, and then sit on, or should I sit on 80 for longer to maybe see this keep going up? I guess it would have to go up here, or to 70 or something like that, and then stay here. What's the best? Is there because then I could just sit on the bike and start, where the other one I have to take 10, 12 minutes to warm up, quote unquote, and then I can do my steady state.
No, I would start on the bike. I would start with those 80 and ride those, and you have to kind of see. You'll see if you do enough of these sessions that you actually start getting changing in your responses, because there's going to be a training effect and an efficiency effect. And so you'll have to kind of track a little bit. This is how using Moxy to help with warm-ups is useful. So in generally, what I would say is the classical approach is you just ride 80 a little bit longer and make your increasing performance, the let's say ramping into that slower. And see how it tracks.
It's just super boring. That's really what it is. But which I'm okay with.
Steady state training is boring. I mean, I'm not a big fan. I like steady state training like when I'm in the mountains and I'm mountaineering. I'm just walking. But like indoor steady state training is not a thing that I'm a big fan of. But lots of people are, right? So, but some people do get better responses from some intensity at the beginning too.
Okay.
Right. You could try, hey, can I stimulate the system with some intensities and then ramp into my steady state, right? So that there is very individualized responses to that. And I find that non-endurance trained athletes respond better to some intensity in their warm-ups, whereas like very classically endurance trained athletes respond much better to these kind of slow warm-ups.
Okay, cool.
But that means both can also be trained.
Yeah, exactly. And would there be a case for thinking about the kind of the balance, or the point where you shift fuel utilization between more fats to more carbohydrates, that you could measure with a metabolic cart, and then using that as your target intensity for the steady state session, like kind of just under that balance point, so that you are still using mainly fats? Does that make sense?
Yeah. So to use a metabolic cart to help you identify that.
Yeah. So identify the kind of where you switch from fat to carbs, to speak a bit roughly, and then use the power metric off of that test to determine what your steady state intensity should be, which, if the goal is to optimize fat utilization, you want to be below that balance point, right?
So there's a couple different things. So you could use a metabolic cart and you would measure RER, so rest exchange ratio, and you would see, am I utilizing more fat? Now, RER, it does correlate with changes in SMO2. So like these higher SMO2 values correlate with lower RER, so more fat burning, which is the argument that I was making before, that you want to have higher SMO2 values if you want to be utilizing fat. I mean, this all correlates with lower performance too, right? Like at lower performance levels. These are all, they're there's some confounding factors there because it just all happens in kind of the same area. Another thing you can actually do, which is easier than the metabolic cart, which is lactate's useful for, is that changes in lactate values identify increasing glycolysis. So basically, if you have increases in blood lactate values, you are now have an imbalanced glycolysis where you're producing more lactate than what you're using up. Now, it's not perfect because if once you start seeing increases in lactate, you've come to the point where you're using so much glucose and glycogen that you're producing so much lactate that it's now out of the balance. But you're probably using a whole bunch of glucose and glycogen before it's out of the balance, but you just happen to be recycling it in the muscle because you don't track what happens in the muscles. So you would need to back off that level by quite a bit if you still want to do fat burning. But that lactate's useful for assessing substrate use because it's linked to glucose and glycogen use.
Okay, cool. Do you have time for one last screen?
Yep, do it.
Cool, let's do it.
I wonder how many people would view this video. This is long.
It is. You can cut it up. You can chop it up for people's.
No, I think it's good to kickstart the backers forum as well, because I think
it's.
I would be interested to see what how other people argue some of the graphs you show, because I get stumped on some of the stuff too. So all right.
So this is spirometry this time. So we're talking about breathing. Nice. This is me before and me after. So the time interval is, I believe it's about a month. And in that time, so I started training a bit more on the bike, which I wasn't really doing before. And I did a handful of respiratory training sessions with the P100. And I was just wondering if that was kind of a normal delta within about a month of, again, if you take me as an untrained person, what was on the left is whatever was left from my lots of rowing 2 years ago. And then maybe as I stimulated the system a little bit through, again, just a handful of respiratory sessions with the P100 and a few bike sessions, I was just wondering if that was a kind of a normal increase in FVC from over a few weeks for someone who hasn't been using the respiratory system at all pretty much before that point.
So it's a pretty good. So the biggest that jumps out obviously is FVC, is like up almost a liter. It's big. That's a big change. I mean, let's say if that's consistent and everything was measured properly, it's just like your lungs just fill up almost a liter more. Now, if it's usable or not, that's different. But the fact is, and this is one of the things, is that your lungs didn't get bigger. Right. What happened was more likely that there's an increased efficiency, and your rib cage can open more, and there's increased mobility and things like that, which is all useful, right? So people get stiff, and you want to increase this. And now that means technically, like the peak availability of what you have to intake oxygen via your respiratory system is higher now than it was before. So obviously and I think that's a pretty good improvement in whatever you say, 4 weeks. That's pretty solid. Now, generally when people start with respiratory training, they get pretty big changes at the beginning,
right?
Because they tend to be stiff, right? And so you get these big. It's with S&C, with like almost anything, right? That, and it also comes on top of that, then you're not maybe you're not an endurance athlete either. So endurance athletes maybe show a little bit less in general improvement. Cyclists often show a lot more because they tend to be like pretty immobile because of the position that they're in. They're always like hunched like this.
Interesting.
And so you get a lot more mobility out of that.
Yeah.
And then
sorry, go ahead.
And then so FEV1 is also higher, which is good. So it's also a problem would be that if your FVC went up or your FEV1 didn't, that would show some kind of potentially some kind of obstruction That's what COPDs look at, right? They look at like first, second, and 6-second volume to see how quickly they're getting oxygen out. And COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, so they have obstructions, which you don't have, and you're at about 80% FEV1, FVC, and stays about the same. So that's good. That's also a good solid. That's a good solid value. Yep.
Maybe the question that I have was kind of going from that, and I'm really interested in the way that Daniel kind of frames the respiratory system, as in you get capacity and then capability. So when he talks about capacity, it's the basic spirometry that we see here: FVC6, FEV1, the ratio. How much do you have? And then it's, can you use it in exercise, which again makes a lot of sense, but demands the metabolic cart or the VO2 master or the Pinot. What I was wondering is there, or have you played with any kind of baseline protocols on the P100 as a way to assess somebody's ability to ventilate a certain percentage of FEV or FVC with an increasing respiratory rate? What I mean by that is just like you would set up a 0515 with the different steps going up, intensities that are relative to the person's ability and where you want them to fail, quote unquote, on that fifth step. Theoretically, could we also set up a base protocol on the P100 to say, like, let's breathe, for 3 minutes, just throwing a number out there, for 3 minutes, starting at 20 breaths per minute at, let's say, the upper limit, if I remember correctly, what Daniel was talking about. During an effort, you probably want to be moving, in terms of tidal volume, you probably want to be moving between 75 and 60% of your FEV, which is about between 60 and 50% of your FVC. So if we start on the higher end and say, okay, how far can I move 60% of my FVC with an increasing respiratory rate? So we do 3 minutes at 20 respiratory frequency, and we keep the volume at, say, 60% FVC or 75% FEV, whichever one you want to pick. And then take a break, 1 minute or 2 minutes, and then go up to 25 breaths per minute, then go to 30, and keep increasing like that to the point where the person can't ventilate anymore, which would allow us to then say, hey, maybe that's where we need to be training in terms of specific respiratory rates and volume to get that person to get better without needing, and I'm not saying that it's a full-blown replacement and a good one, but for people who don't have a metabolic cart available or any way to measure that, could that be a way to assess respiratory function it's not during an effort, again, because there's not the whole body working, but maybe isolate the respiratory system to test it and then draw some or infer some training recommendations based on that kind of respiratory step test, really. Does that make any sense?
Yeah. So specifically with the P100, the work I've done with the P100 is very much in like the development and less in the actual applied use. I think you've probably used a P100 with athletes more than I have. So I haven't used it very much. I use the Spiro Tiger a lot, which is kind of the same thing without all the features. But what I know is that there is development of something like an incremental step test for respiratory training, and EDIOC and P100 is looking at that as well, which goes into what you're saying. You just kind of go through the profile, and I do think that's useful to get a performance profile. Now, there's a couple questions there. It's like, you're finding a performance peak, and the question is, if you then want to generate a training plan based on that, are you generating it just based on performance peak, which you could do? That'd be the same as doing a power profile on a bike and having, my steady, or at the end of my ramp, I can do 350 watts, and then there's no physiological input from it at the end, right? One thing that my dad actually did quite a bit, which I think is an interesting method of doing it, is he basically did what you said. You run step test, and he did it also with a stable volume and increasing respiratory rate. And what he did to get a physiological response is he would measure with a pulse oximeter on your finger your arterial oxygen saturation. You could actually also try using the Moxy on your rib cage, so on your intercostal muscles, because that would be the working muscles. And then you look for breaks like you do with any test with NIRS. You look for breaks in that signal to get a physiological response. So you would go through the different respiration, you would increase and increase and increase, and you'd wait until you see drops in your pulse oximeter. And the drops in the pulse oximeter would say, well, somehow you're not loading your arterial blood, so maybe it has something to do with Dempsey's metabolic reflex, right? So like your respiratory muscles are working too hard, so your arterial blood's not loading as much anymore. And so
would that happen without a whole body exercise motion being performed at the same time? Would the diaphragm be able to shunt enough blood and oxygen away from everything else if you're at rest? Technically, if you're just breathing into the P100 sitting down and not on a bike or on anything else?
Yeah, so it happens.
Okay. Yeah.
So you can try. Do you have a pulse oximeter?
Yeah, I've got.
Yeah, try it out. Try to go through the profile and throw a pulse oximeter on. Yeah, and throw a pulse oximeter on and go through the. That's also something you can use generally when you're testing athletes. Pulse oximeter helps because something that does happen with athletes who have good oxygen utilization is their pulse oximeter value, so their arterial blood values drop. That doesn't happen with athletes that have bad utilization. So that's also another tool that helps you kind of pick and choose these limiters. It also helps like identify respiratory problems, right? Because you're not. This is what Dempsey was talking about, right? That you basically start flowing through too fast and you're not being able to upload oxygen.
Yeah. So I was wondering if that was maybe a valid way to set up a respiratory specific test without having the metabolic stuff. And it sounds like it's possible. I guess I just have to try it a bunch. And I like the idea of the Moxy on the rib cage to see what's going on. Is it hard to hit the intercostals or? Yeah.
It's also small people nearly impossible because the ribs will be closer together.
Right.
But there are I can send you some studies. There's some studies that look at intercostal during incremental exercise, and they find break points as well, just like you would on your VL. They actually coincide in similar positions. So you would also then find kind of like a zoning area for your respiratory muscles using the Moxy. Again, the problem is a little bit lots of artifacts. Are you getting the placement right? The Moxy is not the best NIRS tool for that. Ones that have separated probes that you can put on make it easier. But but I would try doing both, man. Throw a Moxy on your rib cage.
It's a good idea.
Throw on a pulse oximeter and see what you get.
I'll play with that. I'll play with that for sure. Thanks for the insights.
Yeah. Oh man, it's 10 o'clock. Holy moly. I actually have to get going here pretty soon.
Sure.
But yeah, hey, I'm definitely gonna, maybe you can throw up some of those examples in the backers forum, and I'll probably put this video up for people to watch. It's probably gonna be a little tedious, but maybe it's more for the backers forum as a link. People can in the backers forum take a look, and then if we talk about some of those examples, and I start saying things that I didn't say in this video, people can call me out on it. So
yeah, no, I think Andrew, that and from experience, because I have been sharing a lot of even just conversations about the Moxy on my channel recently, there is interest, right? People want more of this. So I think that even though it seems long and tedious, an hour and a half of interpreting graphs, I mean, that it's not going to interest everybody, but people who have a Moxy and who want to dig deeper, I think it will interest those people. And it's probably to everybody's benefit to have those conversations out in the open and letting people then make their own interpretation of it as well. So yeah, just from my perspective and experience, I mean, I never think about whether it's going to be boring for people or not, because it's not for me to judge. And if I prejudge my work, then I limit myself, and I feel like let people decide what they think about what we put out, right?
Yeah, that's right. That's great, cool. John, thanks a lot. So
of course,
yeah, this is cool. And I guess we'll talk to each other on the backers forum or in other venues. So maybe we'll do some more videos or do some more chats or something. It's interesting talking to you, and you get some more interesting examples. Feel free to share those.
Yeah, well, I'll keep collecting, and yeah, maybe
Mm,
we can do another one of those down the line at some point.
yeah. Yeah, I actually I just published a co-authored a paper that looked at muscle oxygen breakpoints in forearms for climbers during incremental climbing on like a tread wall where you change the
Okay, yeah,
slope. So
yeah,
you find some breakpoints there as well. So
cool.
it's interesting on small muscle groups. So
Yeah, no, that's great.
um,
Can I get 2 minutes of your time off the air?
yeah, of
If
course.
we're done
Yeah,
with the chat.